I'm Michael Barnes. I'm the director for the Center for Election Systems here under the Secretary of State's office.
Awesome. And I'm Marc Nolan. I'm the Joe Blow voter who wants to find out about the 2020 election, and on this journey we've been on for last week, meeting different people in the organization that have had some understanding of what's happened for many years in Georgia, but specifically around the 2020 election.
Okay. Well, glad to meet you and glad to have you here today.
Thank you. So my focus today is really going to be on technical and somewhat functional areas. I know you have some background in the Dominion person couldn't make it today, or for whatever reason. And I find that interesting. I won't read you the quote, but I did see a quote from John Polish yesterday or the day before that said, we're transparent and we're willing to meet with anyone that wants to talk about the state of Georgia. Interestingly enough, their Dominion representative decided not to meet with us, so I got you. It's not a downside, right?
Well, I hope not.
No, so I'm going to try to get as much technical as I can with you, and functional, but then, I can cross over into some of your role, or what you've done here would be extremely helpful, I think, just from the projection of how long you've been within the state and how long you've been doing things here.
Sure.
So thank you very much for that. So if you can give me just a brief overview of, I know you came out of, you worked with the GEMS environment, GEMS DRE. Was that your first start here?
Yeah, I've been with the Secretary of State's office since 1998.
Okay.
And in 2001, I transitioned sort of into the elections role. And that's when the state was going through the process of transferring to a uniform system of voting.
Was that Governor Barnes's
That was Governor
21st
Barnes,
century?
Yes, exactly. That was in response to the 21st Century Voting Commission.
Correct, okay.
Was when the legislature decided to act and move to a uniform system of voting. So I was involved with that process way back in 2001, and then stayed involved with the voting system and continue to be involved with the voting system today. And we did go through a transition into a new system in 2019 and are now transitioned into the system that we're using today.
Okay, good. So I'm going to ask you some technical questions around Dominion. If you can't answer them, understand.
Yeah.
I'm a software guy by background and history and implementation. So let's go back to 1993.
Okay.
If we can, just for a second. So you were involved in a lot of things that happened throughout the state. Have the same counties over the last 20 years had the same problems? They got 159 counties.
Yeah,
so.
there are always issues that come up with every election, and it's not always the same counties that have issues. A lot of the time, the issues arise because of close elections. Whenever you have a close election, everybody's focus is on that election because of its close outcome.
Sure.
So we tend to always hear the same counties. You might always hear DeKalb County, you might always hear Fulton County, you might always hear other counties, Bibb County, Camden County, Chatham County, of those. And it's not necessarily because they always have problems, it's because they're close to where media outlets are. And media outlets are wanting to report on what's going on in the election, so they go to the closest nearby, and that becomes more of a microscope issue because of proximity. But with every election, we don't know where the problem may or may not arise, so we have to be ready to respond no matter where it is. If it's in Dade County, if it's in Seminole County, we have to be ready to respond no matter what.
Okay, thank you. So when was the original elections management server that prepped counties for elections installed at KSU Center for election systems?
Well, you're talking about the Center for Election Systems in its previous environment when it was still at Kennesaw State University.
Right.
And that's where it started. It started at Kennesaw in 2002 and stayed in Kennesaw until the end of 2017. The center had a system where it had its public-facing environment, and it also had its internal environment for doing all of the building that we do for ballot building, for prep work to prepare the files that are needed for individual counties. That equipment was installed in 2002, was maintained by the university up until the time that it was time to depart from Kennesaw.
Okay. So someone made a decision at some point in time that said, we've got to move out of Kennesaw State University and either take this on ourselves. Were they part of the Secretary of State's organization back then?
They were contracted.
Okay.
Basically was contracted for services in regards to supporting the elections operations within the state.
Okay.
So the same operations that we perform here at the Center for Election Systems under the Secretary of State's office were the same operations that the Kennesaw Center were performing, which were county training, county election support around election time, building the ballots that are needed for the individual elections, and also equipment testing prior to its distribution out to the counties.
Okay, thank you. So you were a technical advisor to the Safe Commission during that evaluation for multiple times since you said in 2003 you got there?
Right. Anytime that there was any type of question about either the existing system back in the day, or as the state was transitioning to a new system, if person of the state on the Safe Commission had a question about just general voting system practices, I would be involved in trying to help give them a good answer.
Okay. Was there an investigation? I couldn't seem to find this, but I remember seeing something about this person, Logan Lamb. He or she had found some internet exposure, 2017. Mm-hmm. And was there an investigation onto the vulnerability, and how did you determine how to mitigate before the servers were wiped? Do you remember that whole scenario that happened?
Yeah, I do remember all the instances of going on there. In relation to that environment, the Kennesaw Center had a web server for distributing information to counties, and also for communicating back and forth with counties. And that was the device that Mr. Lamb came in contact with, was that web server.
Okay.
And there were particular files on the server pertaining to elections, but nothing directly involved with elections operations.
Okay.
But that server was then quarantined and maintained and held by the university. And then at some point in time, the university did go through a cleaning process, but in their management.
Okay. Awesome. I have just two questions from your standpoint, then we'll move into Dominion.
Sure.
Okay, in 2020, because these are all tied to 2020. Mm-hmm. I've asked several people this question, and I can't get an answer. I mean, I can't get a straight answer. I mean, there's an answer. Mm-hmm. You know, there's the reason and there's a real reason. Mm-hmm. Like when I used to do software implementations, I'd say, do we win this bid or not win this bid? And they say, well, you lost it because of price. And then the real reason was something else about it. Mm-hmm. They didn't like me, they didn't like my looks, they didn't like our company, whatever it was, right? And that usually came out when you dove a little bit deeper. So my question is, were you concerned at all, or did anyone from DOAS, which you must interface, I'm sure you interface with DOAS on RFPs, mm-hmm. and how things go downstream, the technical aspects, how it was done. Mm-hmm. I'm just an old implementation guy, so when I heard that, you know, Dominion was number 2, ESS&S was number 1 on the technical side of the house, Mr. Sterling came back and said, okay, we're going to do a BAFO. Well, he didn't call it a BAFO. He just said, we're just going to bring you in. You got to sharpen your pencil. You're too high. You're too low. And I've never seen that. In my 30 years of implementation in the software business, mm-hmm. I've never seen where any company was allowed to come in and do both those kind of things, right? You either were number 1 on the technical side, mm-hmm. right? And you're number 2 on the functional side, and then the evaluators, which I think you were one of them. No?
I was not. I was not part of the evaluation team,
okay.
or in part of the process of negotiating,
okay.
The close of the RFP and into the contract negotiations. So, unfortunately, I can't really answer a lot of what happened between
right.
negotiations between
okay.
the Secretary of State's office
okay.
and Dominion in that regard.
Well, you've been in the Secretary of State's office since 2000. Or 1998, or
yes,
whatever it was.
yes.
So this would not be new to you if someone said, hey, we did this and this and this, and you're like, okay, well, that's different than we've done in the past.
Well, any time that I've had any development, any organization or involvement with the contracting environment, it's always been through guidance through DOAS, through guidance with our procurement office. And in the histories where I've been involved, they've never let the Secretary of State's office play outside the rules. Is that you stay within the rules that are established by DOAS, by the procurement process, because we do not want contests.
I understand, yeah, or conflict, sure.
Or conflicts. So,
yep, I understand.
Again, I can't really speak to what happened in those negotiations because I was not part of them.
Okay, did that surprise you at all how that went down?
Well, again, I don't necessarily know how it went down. I
Okay.
know that they sat down, they talked, they discussed things, but I do not know to what extent, what was involved, what was said.
Okay, all right. The evaluators, I don't know if you know any of the evaluators that were on the RFP team and DOAS. This is where I can't get the question answered. In the state of Texas, and I'm sure you've had some interactions because of curling, and we're not going to get into the curling and Kemp stuff just to keep you away from that. Okay, so hopefully you won't have to deal with that. But in DOAS, okay, there's someone there that does reference checks, I would imagine. And again, in the world I come from, and I mentioned this to Secretary of State Raffensperger the other day, reference checks are king. You know, when you're going after a multi-million-dollar contract, multi-year, multi-million-dollar contract, that's $107 million, and I've been involved in a lot of them, you know, references are very critical. And I can't get anyone to tell me, I guess I have to file a FOIA request or something to find out who were the references they checked on. And for instance, the state of Texas, you know, had rejected Dominion. Since 2013, I think 3 or 4 times. Brandon Hurley and some other people had written documentation. And what concerns me as not just as a voter, but as someone who says, okay, if I'm going to do reference checking, I want to find out where this house has been installed, who likes it, and then what other areas have been problems. I mean, I know Colorado had an issue. I think they banned the 2D ballots, if I remember, the scanners or something like that. I'll get into that. And then, you know, no one checked. I don't know if anyone checked the state of Texas and asked the guy who's been doing this for 20 years and said, we've denied them state certification 3 different times from 3 different systems, all the way up to the Democracy 5.5. So do you know who they checked references with by any chance?
I don't know who the evaluation committee
I'm 0 for 4. I'm 0 for
right,
4.
No, and I wish I could give you more, but unfortunately, because I was not on the evaluation committee, I don't know what discussions the evaluation committee may have had on those items.
Okay, all right. So you didn't know anything about the system being, the manual system being banned from Colorado for its barcode voting accumulation that hacks into voter vulnerability. Would you hear anything about that at all?
I don't know about what each individual state decides they need in relation to a voting system. I know that there are a limited number of vendors in regards to voting equipment.
Correct.
And that each county assesses that equipment or each state and county assesses that equipment for what its needs are under its legislative code. So every state does elections in their own way.
Sure.
So just because one state deems that a system may not meet what they need it to meet doesn't mean that it doesn't rise to what another state does need.
Sure. 2 questions left. Are there, around your role, are there other Michael Barnes in the other 49 states that you interact with or interface with or go on Zoom meetings or head down to Jekyll Island and play golf for 3 or 4 days and then spend 2 minutes talking about the state of elections?
Well, I mean, each state, again, manages their own elections operations. And there are a caveat of people from state to state that are involved in managing voting equipment. There isn't basically a weekly Zoom meeting of any meeting where we all get together and say, hey, how is things going in Delaware, or how are things going in Utah this week? But periodically, these groups do get together and talk about certain things in relation to equipment testing or what they are hearing from vendors that might be under development.
Sure.
There are organizations that the EAC, the Election Assistance Commission,
and NIST.
And NIST pulled together to talk about voting system needs, voting system guidelines, to provide a better roadmap to vendors so they can build better systems.
Thank you. I did mention that to Nancy in our great conversation we had the other day. Not that this is not a great conversation. That, you know, I would love to see a standard. She's on the standards committee, and I said to her, you know, you're on the standards committee. I would think EAC would want to have a baseline of voting system standards under NIST or under whatever it was, because you had the VVSG 1.0 and now it's 2.0 or whatever it is now, right? I know it's a pipe dream to have a national software elections organization where there's one big bid that goes out for all 50 states, right? Because they say that's states' rights. Okay, that's great, but then we have the federal government that comes in and says, well, you have states' rights, but I mean, like HB1, they want to take over the elections, you know? Clearly, they don't care about states' rights in that regard, just in certain things they care about states' rights, right? So would you, if you were to say, if there was a Shangri-La that you and I didn't have to have these conversations or ongoing dialogues with, federal lawsuits and state lawsuits, if there was a Shangri-La, if there was one system that could interface where Marc Nolan went from Georgia back to New Jersey, God forbid, that's where I'm from, but not heading back there, and wanted to vote, and it was a seamless environment, where we could all do it under NIST or some other guidelines. Do you see problems with a one system voting application that has English, Spanish, my wife's Filipino, Tagalog, Russian, whatever else it is, right? Do you foresee that would be something that you would think would be a good thing or a bad thing?
I don't know if I have a direct opinion, yes or no, good or bad in that regard. In regards to elections, I always fall back to where the Constitution outlines that elections are state activities. They are not a federal operation. And to this day, the federal government has never executed an election. They are dependent upon the states doing that work. And then in a lot of regards, the states even pass that down to individual counties.
Counties, yeah.
Where the counties themselves do the work. The concept of everybody has the same thing, well, Georgia sort of follows that concept, where we have a uniform system, and we've had success with that, where everybody in the state has the same system, all the counties have the same interfaces that they work with, have the same protocols in place, follow the same rules, and we've seen benefit from that. Would we see the same benefit if the federal government, came back and amended the Constitution and said, hey, we need to have, federal elections, and now that we're going to have a federal election service, here's going to be a uniform system? Maybe. It might work good, but every election has its own little
nuances.
Yes. And anytime that you have nuances, that creates places where things can bog down.
Correct.
In order for a grand uniform system to work, you have to have a lot of answers to questions. And a lot of the time, you don't know what the questions are before they're asked. And when you're having to move something that's so massive, a lot of the time we talk about elections sort of like it's an aircraft carrier.
Oh yeah.
And you being a former military, it takes a while for that aircraft carrier to turn around.
It does.
And in a statewide system in Georgia, when we have to make an adjustment to like software on a touchscreen, that's 33,000 pieces of equipment that have to be installed, have to be tested, have to be verified as working well. That's part of that aircraft turning around. And when you have finite timelines where ballots have to be ready at 49 days prior to an election for UOCAVA purposes, absentee balloting mail out begins 45 days. If you have a subtle change that happens at 50 days prior to the election, what are you going to do? Because the election date's not necessarily going to move.
Right.
So a grand one-size-fits-all environment sounds good, but it could lead to even bigger headaches that we're not anticipating.
Okay. So in the 2020 election, Andy hates it when I go off for 3 minutes and talk about something else. So I said I might be focused on 2020, but I had to give you some background.
Sure.
And in the 2020 election, there's been all sorts, and even prior to 2020, of allegations of various issues, not with just Dominion, but with all voting systems throughout the U.S. and even more around EAC. And so my question is, are any of those vendors or any of these vendors in your world too close to the EAC and, of course, to the D.C. lobbyists? It's a loaded question, but...
I can't really say. I mean, Dominion and all election vendors, they are vendors. And they are, going to do what they can to bring good favor to their business, just like anybody would do for business purposes. And the EAC is a oversight group that sort of sets the standards for voting equipment. And it's important for vendors to have discussions with EAC because it's going to be the vendor that's going to build the system. And there has to be good dialogue between the builder and the person that designs the systems to basically say, is that possible? Because if you set a lot of criteria that cannot be achieved by the vendor, then you never get a system that meets the criteria that's been established.
Right.
You're always using equipment that's older.
Right.
That we would like to have updated, but because the update that's been requested or required is not yet achievable. Doesn't mean that it can't be done, but it just means that it's a little bit further down the road.
Okay.
And again, we're having elections all the time.
Right, exactly.
So
Sure.
if you're telling a customer, well, yeah, we're working on that, but that's 2 years down the road, then that could be a situation like, well, then I'm not going to go that route. I'm going to go this other available route.
Good, good. So do you believe that the 2020 election was fair, accurate, and error-free election from Dominion or whoever it was, software side, along with his partners, and that they used? And if so, why?
Yes, I believe that the election in 2020 was fair, accurate, and reflective of what the electorate chose. I believe that just because of the amount of testing that has gone on continually within the voting system leading up to that election, and then also the execution of the election by the election officials, and then finally all of the post-election inspection that has been done. The hand counting of almost 6 million ballots cast in the state of Georgia that were not only counted one time on election night, but a second time in a hand recount, and then a third time in a complete rescan of the ballots. So those things added up. In addition, even elections that happened in 2021 that further, did a process of have an election, recount the election, audit the election. Everything comes back and shows that the system is counting a result that is equal to the intent of the voter when they use it.
Okay, thank you. So how would you explain all the irregularities that have been identified, such as voter tabulation malfunctions, 93% of adjudication rates, more votes than ballot images, lost or stolen original ballots? I mean, I always hear it's human error. I mean, that's always a great fallback. It's those friggin' humans, those damn human beings. They're doing it. So, I mean, is it really a human issue? Because I believe it's a systems issue. I believe software systems, I believe computer systems should be designed with the user in mind, with error-free things where they shouldn't have to have an error. I mean, I think Gabe said the other day, we have Claymore mines in the military. We have them front-facing, and basically says, "Hey, stupid, don't do this," right? And I mean, his point was we even had to put that kind of scenario in with some of our counties before we did it. I think that's crazy, but I mean, what do I know? I'm just the average Joe Blow. So if you're, the hyperbole I'm trying to stay away from, because when we had Governor Bullock back in 1775, they probably had election issues back then. Probably they just shot people back then. They didn't agree on right. There wasn't any software back then. So from a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being perfect, and what technical score would you give Dominion as to the completeness of the software being implemented, and why that score?
Well, first of all, I'll say, whenever you work in elections, the goal is the perfect election. And I've been working in elections for over 20 years now, and we've never had a perfect election. And I don't think that there will ever be a perfect election, just because of all the moving pieces that are involved in the process. Yes, there are technical pieces that are involved, but there are also the manual pieces that are involved, and the knowledge of what are the procedures to follow. And a lot of the times, the mistakes that may take place can be brought back to the lack of following the steps in the right order. And what happens with a lot of elections operations are people are trying to get done as fast as they can. And speed sometimes can be the enemy of accuracy. And what we have always tried to tell county election officials is that it's not about being done first, it's about getting things done right and taking your time. But in today's environment, most people, when we have an election, even though it may be nationwide, they have an expectation that when they turn on the 11 o'clock news that night, the 11 o'clock news is going to be able to tell them the winner. And when you're processing millions and millions of ballots and trying to make sure that you don't make a mistake in that process, you're probably not going to have the results ready at about 11 o'clock at night.
So, Mr. Barnes, do you believe that the Georgia 2020 election was fair, accurate, and error-free election from the Dominion software side, along with its partners they used, and if so, why?
I believe the 2020 election in the state of Georgia was a fair, accurate representation of what the voter's intent was.
Okay. And then you got my questions about the irregularities, right, after that?
Well, I don't know if he actually answered it because it went into,
Yeah.
but go ahead. Just keep going.
Okay, so I think we had that was the question we were talking about. You know,
Okay.
Okay, if that's the case, if that's the case, I'm not saying it's not, but if that's the case, how do you explain all the irregularities that have been identified, such as voting tabulation malfunctions, 93% adjudication rates, more votes than ballot images, lost or stolen original ballot images? Oh, they're just a few of the laundry list I had.
Well, with every election, the goal is to have a perfect election. I've been working in the elections environment now for 20 years, and in those 20 years, we've never had a perfect election. Because things happen within elections. People are trying to get results as quickly as they can out to the public because the public wants to know who won the election. We all have a vested interest in an outcome of an election, especially when you have presidential elections.
Sure.
We hear about them so much constantly. Turn on the news. It's the first story every night. So whenever election day comes, we want to know who won as soon as the polls close. Well, counting the votes is a process.
Like Dewey versus Truman?
Right. I mean, that's a good example, is that we went to bed that night and there's the headline that Dewey's won, but then turns out Dewey didn't win. And now we have the beautiful picture.
Right.
But there is still, and as we, in our society where we have instant gratification on what's the temperature in Hancock right now? Well, it's this. There's an expectation that on election night, as soon as you close the polls, you know who won. Well, that's not the case. Is that we've got to reconcile all of this stuff. We've got to have each scanner print out a result. We've got to collect the ballots out of the scanner and make sure that we've got all the ballots. Then we've got to get them placed in materials and seal things to get them back to the processing center. We've got to get the information that's in the scanners extracted. We've got to bring that back to the elections. It has to be all accounted for. It can't just be taken out of here and immediately plugged in. It's got to go through a checking phase to make sure that nothing bad is being introduced into the system. So all of these procedures and protocols are in place to try to protect the content of that ballot. And then when we get into the process of uploading or scanning ballots, when you're dealing with paper, when you're counting pieces of paper, it's an easy task, yet when you're counting thousands upon thousands, that test becomes a little bit harder.
Oh, yeah.
And it's just because we're all human.
Yeah.
Is that 1, 2, 3, 4, somebody said something, somebody knocked on the door.
Correct.
Which one was I at?
Correct.
Well, I got to start over again.
Right.
Because you want to be accurate.
And the older you get, the more you have to do that.
Exactly. And poll workers, we talk about the age of poll workers, and we're fortunate with all the poll workers we have in the state of Georgia. We have young, we have old, we have experienced, we have new, but they're all part-time poll workers.
Sure.
They do this once or twice a year. They don't do this day in and day out. When you work with a system day in and day out, you learn about its intricacies.
Yes.
About, this is what this means. This is what this display indicates back to me. But when you do this twice a year, when you sit down at the computer, yeah, I did it last time, I remember it. Well, do you really? And there are materials to follow, there are checklists to follow, but is it still possible that I'm going to miss that one little step because I thought that I'd already done it? Those things are what come into play when you start finding, missteps in the counting process. But the voting system that we have gives us alerts to indicate, hey, go back, double check this. It gives you the ability to step back, reanalyze, make sure it's right, and then move forward again. There's not a point where there's there's so many fail safes in place that if you make one step too far, you can backtrack and say, no, let's reset this. Let's reset the count back to 0. Let's scan it again. Let's make sure that we got this right. When we do training here in class, we emphasize the points of when you're starting to scan ballots, know how many ballots are in the stack before you start scanning it. But it's a really easy mistake, especially when you're trying to do so much so quickly that you just grab stuff, put it in, hit scan. And then you're done and it says, well, that had 24. but in fact there were 25. And now it's, did you catch the fact that it said 24 as opposed to 25? If you didn't, then you're moving forward with 24, but when in fact it should have been 25. The system, it isn't going to tell you that, oh wait, there should have been 25, because the system didn't know that you had a stack of 25. It just knew you put a stack
Just put a stack in there.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's the technical abilities of the system can only go so far. It requires good attention to detail as well.
Good. I was actually a poll analyst up in Cherokee County. So, I wanted to go see for myself how that was compared to my past exposure, a long time ago when I was in politics up in New Jersey. I will tell you, it's interesting. One statement I would ask is that they don't put husband and wives together to count the votes. I saw that twice at Cherokee County. I was with a total stranger. He and I had nothing in common. I think we were both technical guys. That was the extent of our discussions. But I did see some people just going, Mary was passing over to Sam. Sam was just, putting it on there. And I saw that a number of times. So that's a concern of mine that I think moving forward, if Mr. and Mrs. Jones are, when you be nice to them, like, okay, well, you're being here, you're helpful, you are getting paid some of it, but I don't think Mr. and Mrs. Jones should be at the same table together. That's just my justification. Now here's the Dominion stuff.
Okay.
Have you ever read the manual, the Dominion manual?
I'm familiar with some of their manuals, yes, sir.
Okay. So I understand the installation took about 8 to 10 hours. From what I've heard and what I've seen and what I've read, but I can tell you the average installation from Dominion, what I was talking to one person was, he said it's about 8 hours from start to finish. So
when you say installation, what are you referencing?
I'm just taking the software, doing what they got to do, make sure it's already been tested, it's preloaded, loading it into the system for the counties, okay? Doing the due diligence, pressing the button, doing a fake vote, and making sure it's squared away.
Okay.
They're saying that it takes about 8 hours from start to finish. Okay?
What that sounds like to me is the logic and accuracy testing that goes on prior to an election.
Prior to election, yes.
Okay.
Yes.
All right.
So when I was looking at the Dominion installation manual, I counted over 184 steps for the installation. Before I gave up. I was like, oh my gosh, 184 steps. And then, I decided to stop because I'm kind of impatient because I am a little bit ADD. But after 184 steps, I think I counted about another 350 steps, if you will, inside the Dominion manual. So there's probably about a grand total of 500 steps to install Dominion. The total page count over 412 pages. Now, I'm not saying that our average poll worker, our average IT people in Atlanta and in the state are not smart people, but that's a huge amount of a manual that I think is just over cumbersome for someone who is trying to do their best to do the install as quickly as possible, because they're against their own time frame. I got to get stuff done by 11 o'clock. And then I counted another 23 pages of content, pictures, features, and everything else. And this is my point for a COTS, for a COTS component, especially if you're being asked to sharpen your pencil, as Mr. Sterling said, to help out with the taxpayers. I think this is, with 2022 going forward, this is not 1982. We should have commercial off-the-shelf software products, that should have our computer systems should be smart enough to both detect and prevent human error wherever we can, both in equipment, failure, and yes, human error. And I heard, and I don't know if that's happened with some of the problems you had. I don't know if other counties had more problems. Because see, this is where my discussion came with Andy about the skepticism standpoint, right? It seems like those problem children that I've heard since 1993, Mr. Sterling said it out on Twitter, and so did Mr. Raffensperger, about how many problem children we have. I don't want to rehash the whole why they weren't put into the pilot program. To me, that's crazy that you didn't have Fulton into the pilot program or DeKalb or some of the others, but I've already tried that conversation and they nixed that, so that's okay. So would you agree that we should have a better human error rate or better testing of the software before it goes down to find out where the commonalities are in the state of Georgia? Because I got to believe that the people in Fulton are just as bright as the people in Cherokee, and just as bright as the people in Muskogee, or just as bright as people in Cobb County. I heard that, I think Mr. Sterling may have said this, but when we have problem children, we do take poll workers or people out of Muskogee and maybe move them over to, Cherokee, or move them over to Fulton. So to me, I don't think that's the answer. I don't think moving people who aren't competent in their job, right, and letting you go someplace else. We used to have that in the Army. We used to call it no-goes. You're either a go or no-go at the station, right? And if you're a no-go at the station, you shouldn't be allowed to go to another place. Or if you're a go at the station, you should stay at that station and continue it. So I call it the good and the bad and the ugly, the Clint Eastwood model. So do you get concerned at all from a training standpoint with Dominion, or any system, but since we're talking about 2020, did you have any concern from a training standpoint that the training was not up to par for the results that you're looking for?
Well, you could always improve training. Training is a form of education. And one of the things that we do here in this facility is bring counties in and train them on the use of the elections equipment. So finding ways to better train and better educate county election officials, and then county election officials better training their poll workers, is always a task that we are interested in enhancing. Now, getting back to 2020 and a rollout of a brand new system statewide, with 3 scheduled statewide elections, a presidential preference primary scheduled for March, a general primary scheduled for May, and then a general election scheduled for November. That was what was on tap.
And then you had the runoff after that.
Right, and then we had runoffs, but then let's add on to that a global pandemic.
Correct.
Where the concept of how we're going to execute the elections or how we just interact with people completely changes. So the statewide system was procured in 19 with a plan about how are we going to train everybody so that they'll know these systems. And training manuals were developed. I think one of the installation guide you may reference is like the user guide for the Dominion system. And the user guide for the Dominion system is a document that tells you anything and everything about the voting system, about how you build the ballots, how you organize stuff of that nature. So it's the nuts and bolts of the system. But when it comes down to preparing for an election, getting the equipment that the voter interacts with prepared for an election, that's not a 300-step process. That's more like a 85 to 100-step process, which is still a lot of steps.
Still a lot of steps.
But it has to be done in order to validate that the touchscreens are responsive like they should. They're showing the ballots as they should. When I touch the screen, does it mark for that candidate? When I hit print on the screen, does it produce a ballot? Does that ballot then show that selection contained in the text? When I take that ballot, put it through a scanner, does the scanner then produce a result that equals that mark that was placed on the ballot? All of that testing is what's done prior to every individual election. It is time consuming. It takes, in the matter of larger counties, weeks at a time, 8 to 10 hours a day, getting all this prep work done. But the counties have adapted to that as part of their time schedule. But in training purposes, we are constantly trying to find opportunities to put together check sheets, put together, one-page FAQs that allow them to better focus their attention onto the things that are absolutely required and necessary, that if you do it in this step, 1, 2, 3, then you're going to have success in executing your election. You always want to whittle it down to make it as simple for the end user as possible.
Sure, absolutely.
You always want to look at the software as well to see, is there ways that we can make this better? Are there steps that might be, to me, I look at it every day, I see it. But when you don't play with it every day, when you don't interact with it every day, it's not as noticeable. Well, how can we make it more noticeable so that the person that doesn't use it every day doesn't make a mistake? So vendors are constantly updating their software, trying to make it better. But the process of introducing updates is not instantaneous because any change to software has to go through a litany of testing at the federal and state level to make sure that that graphical change didn't create a systematic change that's altering something else later on. So we're always in a process of protection. One thing you really want to have in a voting system is it being static, is that it functions, it does exactly what it needs to do, it is reliable, it is resilient. And that keeps that aircraft carrier going straight and forward. And you're not having to turn around and change that aircraft carrier and make adjustments that take 5 miles to turn around and get going in the right direction.
Now, in an aircraft carrier, I would agree with you. You should have 148 different steps or 500 steps, okay? Because you've got human people, you got people on the ship who are going to die if Joe Blow makes a different decision, right? That shouldn't be done. And that's my point about this discussion, right, at this point. So, you know, in the old days, we had COBOL, right? You know, if then else, you know, kind of thing.
Right.
So here's a for instance that I want you to either see if you can respond to or understand what the technical aspects of Dominion is. For instance, there's an if clause. This was one of the if clauses. In the command prompt where X is the drive letter of the DVD-ROM drive where the Windows installation media is located, DISM/online/enable-feature/feature name : net fx/all/x n resources nsxx/limit IT access. Do you think that, to me, is a bit cumbersome from a software standpoint? Someone who wrote that, okay, it just seems like it's written so verbose and so cumbersome that anybody who has to read that, to your point, can't just go 1, 2, 3, 4 and put it in there. They have to go, oh, okay, prompt, you know, and then they have to make sure it's squared away. So that's just one area I saw. Okay, this is one instance. So do you think that's a bit cumbersome or not? I mean, would you agree if you were a software guy having to do that? Would you do oh my gosh kind of a thing, or would you walk away and go, okay, I'm going to just do that, get back to my next source code and update?
Well, again, in relation to what that's referencing, I can't speak. All I can speak to.
Well, it's just one command prompt
Right.
out of the
well,
whole book.
I mean, I understand that, but when dealing with the election management system that we interact with and that counties interact with on a daily basis, those type of command environments are not involved. It is a GUI environment where basically it is, you know, you select the options that you need to work within particular file directories when things are available to you and you need to, you know, extract information. But in relation to sitting at a command prompt and typing a command within Access, that's not taking place within the election management system at the time that a county user is involved.
Correct. So do you know that, and Andy's going to hate these 3 letters I'm going to ask. He's going to hate it, I know he is. But in the RFP, when you had a demo, was there a demo done by all 3 systems? There was a demo done by ES&S, and Clear Ballot didn't make it because there was a hookup on some issue with the DOAS website, from what I understand. They didn't get their bid in on time.
That's a couple of years ago, and I'd have to think long and hard to get
That's
you
all right.
to
That's okay.
remember
No
what all
worries.
happened.
No worries. From what I heard from the Dominion folks in my research, there are 8 Windows services that had to be started in an order, but the order that these steps must be done in it is not the same as the order and number they appear on the menus of the Dominion product. Now, to me, that seems confusing again. Would you be able? Do you think that's confusing, or you think that's not confusing?
Well, I mean, again, in relation to our system as we use it today, I can't relate what that is to what we are using.
All right. That's why not having a Dominion person here who would have been able to give me those scenarios probably could have helped me out some.
Yeah. I mean, there's a logical flow within the elections management system that we use, outlining, you know, here's the front end where you're doing building of ballots. Here's when you're putting in information about particular candidates' choices. Here's when you're setting up your polling locations. Here's when you're setting up your equipment. And it works within a linear flow of the building process. And then the application that's used to count the votes sort of follows that same dynamic of this is where you would interact with this application. Here's the first step that you would involve. And it is in an organized manner of 1, 2, 3, 4. But when it's fresh to you, when it's brand new, it can seem convoluted.
Yeah.
But once you work with it and have experience with election, it becomes more intuitive. And you can see it, and you can see that it is structured and organized.
Okay. Okay, so from a Dominion standpoint again, you know, one of my issues, I'm just going to read something first to you, and then from a Dominion standpoint. You're familiar with the National Election Defense Coalition?
Slightly, yes.
Okay. So if you're not, I'll tell you who they are. Just
Okay.
so we don't have any hyperbole of, you know, they're Donald Trump supporters, or they're Stacey Abrams supporters, or they're Joe Blow supporters, or they're from Russia. Okay. So the National Defense Coalition is a group of progressives, conservatives, socialists, communists probably. There's probably the whole, you know, everybody's inside there, okay? And we were talking about, you know, one of the things is, you know, why is the internet a problem? You know, why is the internet connectivity a problem? So in my discussion with Gabe, I had brought up that he was on a project management this podcast about called Manage This, and you know, he basically said, you know, he was in Bartow County, he had a problem. He goes, well, just turn on the internet, turn it on, turn it all up, let it go out there, turn it on, don't worry about it, and you know, then we'll turn it off. And he goes, well, you know, we don't have to worry about being insecure because as long as we only know it, no one else knows about it. It was basically what he said. I'm paraphrasing, I don't have it with me, but that's what he said. So wireless modem, and I'm going to give their quote, okay? Wireless modems and internet connectivity are not at all necessary to conduct elections, okay? Recognizing the significant security threats internet connectivity and wireless modems create, many states have prohibited them in their voting systems, adopting strong and secure methods of transmitting election results without needlessly increasing the exposure of their voting machines to hacks. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
So if Gabe said, and this is not a gotcha question, it's more of a Dominion question, okay? So they have in their ICX ballot marketing, you know, BMD device, they have a USB port, and there's a vulnerability issue inside of that because you know what there's an indicator light that's on top of it that shows poll workers when the station is currently in use. Do you know that?
I'll let you keep.
Okay, and then in the demo that I saw, there was a person had a phone that was attached to a USB port, and the ICX actually scanned the files on that phone. Now the person who was in the demo actually didn't complain about it, okay, which is interesting. And yes, Dominion showed the event was logged. They just showed the event was logged, okay. Then, as they provided a person's phone number was attached to the USB port, the ICX scanned the files on the phone. So the question is, do you know of any states or cases where the USB vulnerability has shown up? That's really a Dominion question, but you may know it.
Yeah. Well, all I can speak to is what we have here in Georgia and what we do in Georgia. The BMDs do not connect out to the internet in any way, shape, or form.
Okay.
They are an isolated, self-contained machine. Do they have a USB port? Yes, they have a USB port because we have to be able to load information onto the BMD because the ballot's going to change from election to election. And because the BMD is not directly connected in any way, shape, or form to any other device, we have to transfer information onto that device so that your ballot for that given election will be present for you. And that's what the USB drive is used for on the BMD, is for loading information in. We also have to connect a printer to the BMD in order to print out the ballot that you mark on the BMD and produce. So those two components have to be connected to one another. But that's the two reasons for that USB connection, is to be able to connect the printer directly to the BMD and also to be able to load ballot information onto the BMD from election to election.
Okay, awesome. If I was to tell you there's another way to do that without using the USB, would that surprise you?
In the state of Georgia, the way we load the information is what I just said we do.
Okay. Who built? Do you know who built all the ballot systems for the 2020 elections?
Who built the ballots that were used for Georgia in 2020? As part of the statewide installation of the new voting system, the vendor who was selected would be involved in the building of the ballots for that given election. Dominion won the bid, so Dominion was involved in building the election files that were needed for each election. They would, and our office was involved and working with Dominion in that process. The information needed for each individual election from all the counties was collected by this office and then provided to Dominion in order to build the initial structure of the ballot. Once that initial structure was built, then a proofing packet was generated and sent from this office to all 159 counties. And then each county would inspect their ballot proofing packet, which outlines what the content of the ballot was, list of contests, list of choices in each contest, what precincts are in the project file, what polling places, how much equipment do you have set up to be used for a given election. All of that's part of the proofing package. And then once the county reviewed that proofing package, if they found any corrections, those corrections were submitted to our office for adjustment to the database. If there were no corrections needed, then a sign-off would be received by the county, again by this office, and then this office would instruct Dominion, okay, the election project's ready to be completed and packaged. And then the Dominion would bring that completed project again to this office. And then this office, we would inspect that package to make sure that it has everything set the way that it needs to, that nothing has been changed since the time it was proofed. We would then package up that project file, place it on a media device for transmit to the county. Those devices are set into a locked bags, like a bank bag, with a unique lock on it that is then delivered to the individual county. County then takes possession of the bag, opens up, extracts the media, and then loads that into their local election management computer for execution of the election. So that was the process of ballot building.
Okay, thank you. So where was the test done? Where was the end user testing, if you will? You know, we typically call E8, end user testing. Where was that done? Was that done by Dominion, or is that done by the county? I mean, who accepted everything before what we used to call in the old days production?
Right.
So who accepted it from QA to test to production?
Sure.
Can you give me that process?
When Dominion was bringing product into the state in late 2019, very early 2020, at that facility, as equipment would be basically turned over from the vendor to the state, then my office had a team of testers that would go through what we call acceptance testing.
Sure.
And that's where we would inspect each individual device, make sure that it had the right installation of software, that the software was functioning properly. We put multiple ballots through each device to confirm that it was working properly. Then all of that equipment, once it passed acceptance testing, we put a seal of acceptance on the device, and then the device would be packaged up and then delivered to the jurisdiction.
Was that considered a milestone in the project? Was that considered a milestone?
That's a contract regards question. I can't speak if that was
Okay.
or not. I can just speak to what we did.
Yeah, okay.
And we checked every single piece of equipment, every single BMD, every single printer that was connected to a BMD, every single ballot scanner that was used in polling places, all of the election management computers, all of the central scanners that were used for processing mail-in absentee ballots, provisional ballots. We touched every single piece of that equipment before it could be distributed to a county. And then once it was in the county's possession, they would then test it and still do, test it prior to each individual election to make sure it is still functioning as it should.
Okay, that's good, thank you. Isn't the SOS election management server prepped with ballot styles from a memory stick that receives them from the ballot builders through the internet?
No.
No?
No. No.
Okay, all right, then that person from Dominion was wrong, I guess. That's all right. If that is no longer the case, then how does the process work now?
Well, we build the election ballot files that are needed for individual jurisdictions. We're in the process right now of preparing for March elections. I think we've got 9 or 10 counties that we are building data sets for. So we have computers here in our facility that are not connected to the internet in any way, shape, or form. And on those computers, we build the election project files, build them from scratch. That basically, start with nothing and build out a project file that says, here are the political districts involved, here are the precincts, here are the polling places, here are the types of equipment that will be involved, here are the contests, here are the choices, and that formulates a ballot. When that ballot is ready for proofing, it goes through a proofing process here in our facility before it's ever given to the county for proofing purposes. Once that proofing package is made available to the county looks at the proofing package, approves it, or sends corrections, and then we go through that process of building that media that is then delivered to the county for upload to their system directly.
Okay. And all the counties are the same in that regards?
Yes.
So all 159 counties are the exact same?
All 159 counties get their ballot through the
Process.
same method, yes.
Same process is done. So you
Yes.
shouldn't have any problems after that, right? So you shouldn't have any people raising their hands saying, hey, we got a problem here.
That's the hope, is that they don't have any.
Well, hope- as I say, hope is not
That's why we go
strategy.
through a very
Right.
strong proofing phase to make sure we don't have any mistakes in the ballot before it ever gets to them. Are there still mistakes that are found in the ballot once they receive it? Yes. When you have ballot questions that have hundreds of words in them, is an A missing every now and then?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Well, when that's missing, we've got to fix it.
Well, that's a lawyer issue sometimes. I think,
Well, it may be a lawyer
I think
issue,
lawyers
but
like
it-
to bill more hourly rates
Right,
by
but-
finding A as opposed to the.
Right, but when you're dealing with a ballot question, it has to be correct.
Sure.
We can't say, well, it's sort of correct. No, it has to be
Right,
correct.
because then you have to, because then the peeing contest, if you will. Well, it wasn't really clear to me. If it was an A, it would have been there, and then next thing you know, you're having to handle all these people that supposedly had problems with their ballot issues. Okay.
We're at 58 minutes, so we probably got time for about one, maybe two more.
Good, two more, good. So do you contend that the SOS election management server, the county election management servers, the system scanners, the tabulators, and the no-ink poll books are never connected to the internet from the time an election is prepped until the time an election is certified?
The state's computer that's used to build election management projects are not connected to the internet in any way, shape, or form. The election management computer that is stored at the county location is not connected to the internet. The central scanner and its computer that's attached at the county location is not connected to the internet. The BMDs that voters interact with are not connected to the internet. The scanners that a ballot is fed through for scanning purposes at the polling place is not connected to the internet. The poll pad, which is used to manage the list of voters, that when you go to check in at a polling location in order to find your name, get your particular ballot style. The data set, the way the data set gets onto that device is through a protected Wi-Fi connection within the county elections office. That is the only piece that has any type of connection in what you are outlining. That's it.